All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. There are rumors that the Big 12 Conference could be ready to pursue the Connecticut Huskies to join their league. Big 12 Commissioner Brett Yormark is hell bent on having a coast to coast league, but would UConn fit into that? In order for Connecticut to join the Big 12, that means that they'd have to leave the Big East in all sports. Connecticut is currently a football independent while competing in the Big East in all other varsity sports. But would leaving the Big East be viable for them? Yes, Connecticut has a Division One football team, but their bread is buttered by both their men's and women's basketball programs, as these two programs are the school's athletic backbone. Now, UConn was basically kicked out of the Big East back in 2013 following the breakup of the football and basketball schools. In Connecticut's first year in the American Athletic Conference, they won the national championship in men's basketball with many holdovers on their roster from their time in the Big East. But soon, UConn's men's basketball program would tail off. And with that, along with looming debt, Connecticut decided to cut bait with the AAC in favor of returning to the Big East for all sports except football. Excuse me. And in just the Huskies' third year back in the Big East, they are once again national champions in men's basketball. In my opinion, Connecticut going to the Big 12 would be a seismic mistake for them. Connecticut would be chasing football money, but their football program is not a national brand. And that's no offense to anyone at Connecticut, but this is not a football factory that we're talking about. However, when you begin to talk about the Huskies men's and women's basketball programs, then we're talking about basketball royalty, as it includes the names such as Richard Hamilton, Ray Allen, Rebecca Lobo, and Sue Bird, just to name a few. If I started talking about all of the basketball alumni for both the men's and women's programs in UConn, guess what? I'd be still talking an hour from now, and I don't want to do that to y'all. Now, while in the American, Connecticut was a fish out of water in basketball, as they no longer recruited the New York City area, as this was a lifeline to their program while they were in the Big East. And as soon as UConn returned to the Big East, things began to change for them. Now, in the Big 12, the closest road trip for Connecticut would be traveling to Morgantown to face their former Big East foe in West Virginia. But aside from that, you're talking about traveling cross country to face the likes of Kansas, TCU, Cincinnati, another former Big East foe, Houston, a former foe from the American, and Iowa State. And this is just to name a few of the schools that UConn would have to deal with. Now, in regards to your mark, let's not forget that he and the Big 12 also have their eyes set on Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah if things do fall apart in the Pac 12. We've also seen or heard reports about the Big 12 flirting with Gonzaga. And of course, Gonzaga, it's all about their men's basketball program. But nonetheless, I think it would be a disaster. Cole, what is going on, my man? How you doing? You're saying that would make sense for basketball. Not sure about everything else. You're right. They're not a football factory. Perfect wording, by the way. Thank you. The men's and women's basketball teams, on the other hand, they are powerhouses. And I will say this, Cole, and please feel free to continue to drop some comments in the box here. For me, the biggest thing with UConn, we saw them leave the Big East. And of course, like I said, they really didn't have a choice. They went to the American, and there were some Big East holdovers in the initial American. Louisville was there for a year before they went to the ACC. Of course, Rutgers was there for a year before they went to the Big Ten. But then you also had Cincinnati as well. It just didn't work out. And, I guess there was hope that, UConn, along with Temple, could carry the Northeast portion of the American. But the bottom line is things were just too stretched out. And for me, I look at the Big 12, the current Big 12, and to their credit, they have salvaged this thing because you talk about conferences that have been ravaged by realignment. Okay, the Big 12 more than 10 years ago, they lost Colorado to the Pac 12. They lost Nebraska to the Big 10, Missouri and Texas A&M to the SEC. And then you turn back around and now you're losing Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC. And to the Big 12's credit, they were able to survive. They stuck in there. They brought in TCU and West Virginia, and it worked. And for me, West Virginia, to their credit, having a Hall of Fame basketball coach like Bob Huggins, he knew how to adapt. But now, you lose Texas and Oklahoma, fine. You bring in Houston to give yourself another, Texas football school. Cincinnati, their basketball program has fallen off in the American, and I think a part of that is the fact that Mick Cronin left to take the UCLA job, and then you look at Cincinnati's football program, which has made some tremendous strides in recent years, but then they just lost their coach Luke Fickle to Wisconsin. UCF football wise, I think has the potential to do some things in the Big 12 due to Gus Malzahn and what he does offensively. But to me, the biggest thing is what is the Big 12 going to be? I mean, you look at it, Kansas basketball wise is going to continue to be Kansas. I really, just for the sake of argument, I'm not sure if you could really set up a rivalry, so to speak, with Kansas and Connecticut in that division basketball wise. It'd be terrible football wise, nonetheless. But for me, I think the biggest thing is we've kind of seen this from Connecticut before when they went to the American, and it just uh, didn't work out. And you're saying leaving the Big East was necessary, but in the long run, a mistake. I'd like to see the Big 12 add a few teams from the AAC, especially one, Wichita State, my hometown college, gets football back. Let me tell you something. I thought Wichita State going to the American was a good move for them. Obviously, things have not been the same for Wichita State, especially since they parted with Greg Marshall as their coach. But nonetheless, Wichita State and Kansas, for the sake of argument, a rivalry in that conference would work. That is one thing that I think the Big 12 is missing right there. Obviously, losing out on Missouri. And I didn't grow up in that region, but I still understand and respect the importance of that Missouri versus Kansas battle. And of course, that's no longer the case. And that goes back to the Big Eight days. And that was many years ago. But nonetheless, rivalries are what make a conference, especially when you're talking about close battles within state or maybe a state over or whatever. But Kansas and Kansas State has been a fierce battle on the hardwood in recent years. Kansas versus Kansas State, you just throw out the records rather on the gridiron. But nonetheless, you look at it, and the Big 12, has been a solid basketball conference. They got 7 bids to this past year's or this year's NCAA tournament, nonetheless. Strong basketball conference, solid football conference. We saw TCU get to the national championship game this past year. So there is, some backbone there, but it's just from the travel and the logistics of it. I really do think uh, that Connecticut would make a mistake. And for me, a guy like Yormark, he's a businessman and he's trying to leverage himself as much as possible. And it's not just about bringing in schools, it's all about bringing in schools to kind of keep up with the Joneses, if you will, in said conference. You look at it, the Big Ten has really leveraged themselves, bringing in USC and UCLA. You think about the SEC, and it's just a who's who of blue bloods, college football wise. You think about it, you're going to have Oklahoma and Texas joining that mix. We know what Alabama has meant to the college football scene for about the last 15 years or so under Nick Saban. And of course, going back several generations, first with what Gene Stallings did at Alabama in the 90s. And then, of course, with what Paul Bear Bryant did in Tuscaloosa. But then you think about LSU, Georgia, the two-time defending national champions, Tennessee, Florida's going to get it going at some point, and it's just loaded. So you're posing the question of how do I think BYU will do in the Big 12, and I'll tell you like this: BYU, in my opinion, BYU is like a chameleon. They know how to adjust and they know how to adapt. You think about BYU for all of those years in the old Western Athletic Conference, and they did it with Lavelle Edwards, and they basically did it their way, and they were the team to beat for a long time. And then, of course, the battles with the Utahs and the San Diego States of the world. Then you go to the Mountain West, and you go back about 15 years or so, the Mountain West, it's still a very formidable conference. For how long, I'm not sure, because I really do have a feeling that if the Pac-12 does expand, they're probably going to look to raid the Mountain West first. And I've talked about that in the past, and if you want me to, I'll talk about it a little bit more right now. But nonetheless, BYU in those days in the Mountain West, you had BYU, you had Utah. Let's not forget, you had TCU there before they agreed to join the Big East and did a left turn and went to the Big 12. And I think it worked out for them better anyway, in that sense. BYU adjusted. Then there were money issues, so they said, you know what, we're not going to share the money. We're going to go be a football independent. And, with that said, there were people that, really didn't pay attention to it, but the Big 12 paid attention to it. And the Big 12 tried to get them several years ago and didn't get them to come over. And now they're there. I think BYU is going to be okay. You're talking about, as of right now, the school that's going to be furthest west in the Big 12 conference, but I think BYU is going to be okay with this. And it's one of those where, football wise, you know, they just always find guys, and they find guys in their system, regardless of who the coach is. They graduate their guys, obviously. And, you have guys that take the Mormon mission for 2 years before they come back. BYU has been a good program regardless of the conference. So I don't think that, they're ever, I'm not really going to say they're going to get lost in the wash, but I think BYU is still definitely going to be a formidable team in the Big 12. And, with your mark, speaking of that, you can't blame him for attempting, to leverage himself as much as possible given the current landscape of collegiate athletics. It's basically become a free for all in the mad dash for cash. We're seeing schools turn down big paydays in search of bigger, even bigger paydays from other conferences. What's going to happen with this ACC? And now we're talking about a group of seven. Where are they going to go? Are they going to stay with the conference? Is that conference going to get enough money to keep them happy? I've talked about the Pac 12 multiple times in the last couple of months. Is the Pac 12 going to be able to keep everybody happy? It's just a mad dash for money. But credit to your mark. Again, he's a businessman, and he definitely has to throw it out there. You're saying I would actually like to see the Big 12 poach Iowa from the Big 10. It would make sense in my mind because it makes the games played between them and Iowa State mean more than just state pride. I'll tell you like this, and this is no offense, it's wishful thinking, but at this state of the game, I don't see anybody leaving the Big Ten conference just due to the fact of where the money is for the Big Ten and the SEC. And then everybody else is like one, two, or maybe even three rungs down on the food chain from that. You're talking about a scenario with the Big Ten, and I talked about it last year um, when the announcement first came out that USC and UCLA were going to join the Big Ten. it's a scenario where whoever the conference commissioner is going to be for the Big Ten, of course, at that time it was Kevin Warren who negotiated the television deal, but you figure the Big Ten now has in their back pocket the three largest media markets in the nation. And with that said, they can go into any television executive's office and talk turkey, and they're going to listen to them. Hence why now the Big Ten has deals with Fox, CBS, and NBC. Nobody is going to walk away from that. The Iowa State game, football wise, I will definitely touch on this. To me, it is one of the more underrated rivalry games in college football. And I think partially the reason is for this. I have several reasons. Number one, it's at the beginning of the year. And, but when you peel back the surface and pay attention to the game, the Iowa State games are typically close contests, regardless if we're talking about in Iowa City or we're talking about the contest being played in Ames. And the other thing I will say, with Iowa State and Iowa, they're two teams that typically start off slow and they get better as the year progresses. So I look at it like this: wishful thinking. I think it would make sense, but I don't see anybody of the current 14 and soon to be 16 programs in the Big Ten that is definitely going to be leaving that conference anytime soon. They are a juggernaut. They are a runaway freight train, and money wise, so is the Southeastern Conference. But like the thing is, it's like speaking of the Big Ten, starting next year, they're going to be, a 16 team league, and they're going to be a coast to coast league when UCLA and USC join. But we don't know how it's going to work out uh travel wise, for the student athletes and all of the sports, because yeah, football is a sport that brings in the money, but it's a scenario, the other sports, I know people will say, yeah, the most of the other sports don't exist without football, but nonetheless, you're going to talk about somebody going for a conference baseball game. Now they got to travel from Los Angeles to Happy Valley, or from Piscataway, New Jersey, out to Los Angeles. It's a lot to deal with if it isn't already. But getting back to it, the Big 12, they're looking to get down that road as well, as your mark is trying to make this a coast to coast thing, as they look to survive and try to, protect their brand. And it's natural. Now, Connecticut going to the Big 12 would give the conference the New England market. And the New England market, I talk about the LA market. I talk about the New York and Chicago market in regards to the Big Ten. The Boston market is no slouch too. We're talking about one of the better media markets in the nation. That would definitely help out the Big 12. But I look at the Rutgers scenario, and I said this about Rutgers when they went to the Big Ten. I'm like, yeah, it's going to be good for you money wise, but what are you going to do football wise? And Rutgers, really hasn't done anything. They've just, they've just simply been there. So you look at it for UConn. They would just get lost in the wash, in my opinion, just like they were when they were in the American. Now, however, things could look up for them. I mean, you look at it, the Big East does have 2 years left on his current basketball deal with Fox. And I'm sure that their conference commissioner, Val Ackerman, is working on a more lucrative television deal for her league than the one currently in place. It should be easier for the Big East because 10 years ago, when they got this deal with Fox, there was hope that the Big East, basketball wise, could survive. But I think the Big East has shown that, what, they know how to roll with the punches. And I talked about this during the basketball season, especially NCAA tournament wise, when, when the Big East made, had a couple of teams make deep runs into the tournament. Of course, UConn won it all, and Creighton was within an eyelash of getting to the Final Four. But nonetheless, everybody's committed to each other. And that's what you need from any conference. Everybody has to be on the same page. Everybody has to be committed. I guarantee you, some of these schools are not committed to each other. The ACC commissioner just came out and said, we're stand fast. I guarantee you, some of those school presidents, they're on the phone with the Big Ten. They're on the phone with the SEC trying to find a way if they can get in. The Pac-12 says right now we're all steadfast. I guarantee there are some talks behind the scenes between some of those school presidents and Brett Yarmark and the Big 12. It's just happening. Cole, you're saying, speaking of Rutgers, one of their former running backs, Isaiah Pacheco, now has a Super Bowl ring. I'm a Chiefs fan. I'll tell you like this. Andy Reid, and I'll just jump and ship for a little bit with the NFL. Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes, they know how to pretty guys up and fit them into their system and make it work. Andy Reid's been doing it for years, even going back to his days as a head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles, and of course, most recently Patrick Mahomes during his time with the Kansas City Chiefs. But like getting back to this, it's going to be easier for the Big East to try to get that new television deal. We didn't know how it was going to look when schools like UConn, Pitt, and Syracuse left, but now they've shown that they're still a viable basketball brand. Since 2016, Villanova has won a pair of national championships, three Final Four appearances, and now, of course, UConn just did it just 2 months ago. Now, of course, another question that some people are going to pose: should UConn just go the FCS route in regards to their football program in the mode of Villanova, or would they be okay as a football independent? I'll tell you like this: UConn for many years was an FCS school basically until they joined the Big East for football when the ACC began to raid the Big East with Miami and Virginia Tech and Boston College and the likes of those schools leaving. UConn has never been a viable football program, even now as an independent. And credit to Jim Mora Jr. for making them respectable last year. But I don't see, even as a football independent, I don't see the networks tearing down the door saying, hey, you know what? We need Connecticut football on our television screens. So maybe the FCS route could be a possibility for UConn. I'm not sure. But nonetheless, the room of football independence. And Cole, you'll probably know this. It's not what it was 40 years ago when you think about the independence in those days. You had power programs such as Pitt, Penn State, Florida State, just to name a few, that did not have any conference allegiances. And even in the current state of college football, longtime football independent Notre Dame soon might not have a choice but to join a conference. And I mean, for years, Notre Dame and NBC, they've been like this. But there are rumors that Notre Dame is seeking two truckloads of money, not just a truckload of money, but two truckloads of money in their new television deal. Is NBC going to do it, especially after they've committed to the Big Ten? I'm not sure. And then where would Notre Dame be? It might be a scenario. It would not surprise me in the next 10 or 15 years that you'd see Notre Dame in a football conference. It's one of those, because it's like, for me right now, Notre Dame's just chasing the money. But nonetheless, it's one of those where Notre Dame football on NBC is not what it used to be because everybody's on TV now. That was a big thing for the Fighting Irish 30 years ago. But then you think about some of those rivalries that Notre Dame had that they no longer play. Notre Dame doesn't play Michigan anymore. I'm not sure if they still play Michigan State. They still play USC, the Stanford game. But nonetheless, even before, Notre Dame would consistently play Penn State. So how is all of that going to work out? We got to wait and see. But getting back to Connecticut, they went back to the Big East after they had a lot of financial debt athletically in the AAC, and of course, the COVID year didn't help them. But they still have financial debt. The basketball, men's and women's basketball programs are helping it out, but you know what? They still definitely have a long way to go. You're saying about Notre Dame, you're right. I know outside of football, they're in the ACC across the board, independent in football. Yeah, that was one thing, and I've talked about this before, where it hampered the old Big East because Notre Dame did join them for all sports except for football in the mid 90s. And the Big East tried and tried and tried to get Notre Dame to become a football member. Never happened. And you wonder if this conference football wise would still exist if that was ever the case. And it's the same thing with the ACC. You got a 14 team football conference and a 15 team basketball conference. And I'll tell you like this: if Notre Dame were to join the ACC football wise, for the sake of argument, it would definitely help that conference. But getting back to UConn, could they benefit from a revamped ACC? And I talked about some of these schools that have an eye on the SEC. Some of these schools probably have an eye on the Big Ten as well. If that were to be the case, I'm sure that Connecticut would be appealing, um, to the ACC basketball wise. But even with that said, Connecticut need pay attention to their former Big East brethren in Pitt, Syracuse, and Boston College. They have not been the same basketball wise since they went to the ACC, and they really haven't been the same football wise as well. I know that Pitt was finally able to win the ACC in football back in 2021, but nonetheless, all of these schools have basically been a fish out of water since leaving rather. Now, football helped to destroy the original Big East as everybody was not on the same page, and for a good reason. It was a conference that was founded on basketball, but at the end of the day, I think this is going to come down to Connecticut's president, their athletic director, board of trustees, you name it. These are going to be the people that make the ultimate decision. And would UConn consider going to the Big 12? Maybe. Should they consider it? Different story altogether. Cole, you're saying you just had a thought. Navy is independent across the board, except in football. They're AAC. What do you think happens as far as that goes? Well, I know basketball wise, and I think for some of their other sports, I do believe that they play in the Patriot League. I do believe that's the case. But for Navy, they just did it as far as going to. There were several reasons why they did it as far as going to the American. Number one, the money. Secondly, in doing so, and this was when UConn was committed to the American, they had 11 schools did that conference. They needed a 12th in order to have that conference championship game. And then everything was just simply thrown out of whack after that. That was the only reason why Navy did it. And it'll be interesting to see, would Navy go back to being a football independent when it's all said and done? I'm not sure. We got to wait and see. But at the end of the day, a lot is always up in the air when it comes to things because it's a trigger effect as far as, or domino effect rather. One conference gets the money, then everybody else is going to start looking. Then the second conference gets its money, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And we, figure this thing out. And I think, there's several dominoes that have to fall. I think first and foremost, what is going to happen with the Pac-12? And I think, sake of argument, if the Pac-12 sticks this out, I think the Big 12 would get a little bit more desperate to try to add teams, or maybe they just wait until the next go round for TV deals. But like I've talked about it before with the Pac-12, if they're able to stick it out, SMU is probably going to be on their radar because the Dallas market would definitely help them. San Diego State would definitely be on their radar due to the fact that the Pac 12 would want another team in Southern California. Granted, San Diego State does not have the tradition that USC or UCLA have, respectively, but nonetheless, it still gives you a presence. It wouldn't surprise me to see the Pac-12 reach out to a Boise State, and we know what their football program has been for about the last 20 years or so. Even a UNLV, you already have your conference championship game if you're the Pac-12 in Vegas. Why not have a team there as well? And of course, that Vegas television market is growing. So, it's going to be a chain effect. We're going to see what happens there, and it's going to be a trigger. But the thing is, UConn, I'm not going to say that they're not going to like listen, to possibly go into the Big 12. Should they? Absolutely not. I mean, we've seen this already. As far as UConn, not being in the Big East, being in the American, and it didn't work out, and it darn sure wouldn't work out for them in the American, pardon me, in the Big 12 conference. You look at it basketball wise, UConn has just started to get back on track. Of course, they won the national championship, but recruiting wise, basketball wise, they're getting back to their strengths. They lived off of the New York area, not just New York City, Long Island, New Jersey, Yonkers, Westchester, and of course in their own backyard in Connecticut and Massachusetts, going up into the New England region, and they're getting back to that. So why tinker with that? But at the end of the day, there's so much on the table. We don't know. Money talks and everything else walks. So it all depends on which direction that the powers that be at that school and other respective schools definitely want to go. But like I've said in recent weeks and recent months, this chaos, if you will, that is the money grab in collegiate athletics is not slowing down anytime soon. If a school president can get 40 million from one conference, but another conference is offering him 55, guess what? That's where his school is going. At the end of the day, it's it's a business. So let's just see how it happens. But nonetheless, again, not to sound like a broken record, but I do think that Connecticut would be making a huge mistake leaving the Big East in favor of the Big 12. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it'll be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. Now you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. Cole, I definitely appreciate you chiming in tonight. And before you go, I have one more question for you. I don't know if you can see it in the background, but over my right shoulder, that is a current Big 12 jersey right there. That is an Oklahoma Sooners football jersey. Um, it's one of those where Oklahoma's basically kind of dominated things football wise in the Big 12 since they've been there. Initially it was Nebraska, when the Big 12 was formed, and then, Nebraska shifting a little bit to K State, and then it was Oklahoma and Texas, and then, of course, Oklahoma. So it'll be interesting to see, who's going to step up and seize things in that conference on the gridiron when the Sooners leave. And trust me, I got plenty to talk about over the summer heading into August when we get close to the college football season. You're saying I can't see the whole thing, but I can see the left sleeve, number 28. Yeah, got that when Adrian Peterson was there, and I'll tell you like this: Adrian Peterson, hands down, one of the best backs to ever come out of Oklahoma. And when you think about Oklahoma football, they've had their fair share of running backs. You think about the great Billy Sims, Adrian Peterson, of course, DeMarco Murray. I could keep going down the list, but Oklahoma has, made, developed their fair share of backs. And the same thing can be said for Texas and Nebraska in those glory days of the Big 12 in the late 90s and early 2000s. But nonetheless, folks, my name is William Martin. I'm signing off, saying thanks again for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast. Be well, everybody.